Most people hear Philistines and a preset loads, big, loud, villain-coded, basically extras waiting for David to enter the frame. But then archaeology digs up something strange in Philistine cities, pottery with Aegean vibes, like an Aegean soundtrack laid over a Canaanite scene. And that raises the real question. If the stuff looks foreign, does that mean the people were foreign? Or are we watching a local culture remix itself during the most chaotic moment the ancient Mediterranean ever survived, the late Bronze Age collapse, when kingdoms flickered out, trade routes snapped, and coastlines turned into migration corridors? Because Philistine might not be a simple origin story. It might be a collision story. In this video, we're going from Mycenaean-style pots to the hard, surprising evidence, ancient DNA from Ashkelon, a genetic signal that shows up, then dilutes fast, plus what daily life, food, and boundaries reveal about who the Philistines actually were, not as cartoon enemies, but as migrants and neighbors who blended in faster than anyone expects. Welcome back to Armchair Archaeology, where epic stories get cross-examined by sherds, skeletons, and the stubborn truth buried in the dirt. And stay to the end because there's one tiny artifact from Goliath's world that doesn't prove the legend, but it does make the giant villain version feel a whole lot less confident. The first Philistine signature isn't a sword, it's a floor. Not a metaphorical floor, an actual one. Stone and packed earth rubbed smooth where feet crossed the same doorway again and again, carrying water, carrying grain, carrying a sleepy child on one hip. That's the kind of evidence that makes the usual Philistine costume start to slip. Stories love clean enemies. They love a single label that does all the work, them. Once you have them, you don't have to describe their lives. You only have to explain why the hero wins. And honestly, it's a move we still recognize. Reduce a complicated group to a single word, and suddenly empathy feels optional. But dirt is stubbornly uninterested in moral categories. Dirt keeps the boring stuff. Dirt keeps mornings. So archaeology meets the Philistines in the unglamorous places. A hearth where the ash is layered from dozens of meals. Storage rooms built to keep grain dry through a bad season. Grindstones worn down by repetition, not drama. In the trash pits, you get fish bones and charred seeds. Leftovers that say someone ate here more convincingly than any text says someone belonged here. You find loom weights, heavy and practical, the kind of tool you only bother making if you plan to be around long enough for clothes to wear out. You find beads, so small they feel like they were meant to be held up to light, turned in fingers, lost, found, lost again. None of that screams raiding party. It whispers neighborhood. And there's a weird irony waiting in the background. Centuries later, Philistine becomes an insult. Someone with no taste, no art, no culture. Yet the Philistine cities on the coast read like open doors to a wider world. Their objects care about style and signal, how a bowl is painted, how a jar is shaped, which patterns get repeated until they feel like a badge. So the rewrite starts here, not with a battle, with a home, with the evidence that the enemy category was always a shortcut, and real people are always messier and more interesting than the role they get cast in. If history feels more alive when it stays complicated, when the evidence won't cooperate, subscribe. These are the kinds of stories worth following, all the way down to the dirt.
Imagine you run a coastal town and your whole year depends on next shipment. Tin to make bronze, grain if the harvest stumbles, oil, wine, textiles, plus the little luxuries that remind you the wider world is still humming. For centuries in the late Bronze Age, it did hum. Not as isolated kingdoms, but as a web. Palaces trading gifts like diplomacy, merchants moving metals and goods like clockwork, ships stitching together ports from the Aegean to Egypt. When that web is tight, even a small city feels rich because it's connected. Then the web starts to fail in the quietest, most terrifying way. It stops delivering. If you've ever watched modern shelves empty or a supply chain seize up, you already understand the emotion. First confusion, then improvisation, then panic. A ship doesn't arrive, then another. Metal gets scarce, prices jump, letters go unanswered. On the ground, the same stress patterns begin showing up across the eastern Mediterranean. Burn layers in cities that once felt permanent, neighborhoods that empty out, walls repaired in a hurry and then abandoned mid-course, as if the builders suddenly had somewhere more urgent to be. Imports thin out, storage becomes obsessive, fortifications thicken. You can read stress in the patterns: fortifications, repairs, and rushed rebuilding. At Ugarit, that anxiety is almost frozen in place. Archaeologists found clay tablets that look like they were set down in the middle of work, messages warning of danger at sea, desperate calls for help, the bureaucratic machine still trying to function right up to the moment the city goes silent. It's not a legend about the end, it's an interrupted workday that never restarts. And the key is that this isn't one neat disaster with one neat cause. Different regions break differently. Some cities burn, others shrink, some limp on. That jagged pattern makes sense if multiple pressures stacked: drought and famine in places, political instability in others, raids and piracy along the coasts, and the knock-on effect of long-distance trade snapping. When a connected world turns brittle, people don't just disappear, they move. Coastlines become corridors, new communities form fast, out of newcomers and locals negotiating survival. This is the crack in the system where Philistine begins. Sea people sounds like one clean villain, one flag, one language, one armada you could point to on a map and say, there, those guys. But the ancient sources don't hand us anything that neat. We're the ones who like it neat, because neat stories are easier to fear. When you look at the late Bronze Age records, especially the Egyptian ones, you don't get a single origin story. You get a shifting cluster of names that appear in different combinations, in different years, depending on who's writing and how bad the situation feels. Some groups are described arriving by sea, others by land, sometimes together. Sometimes the tone is pure threat. Other times the details read less like invaders and more like people trying to plant themselves somewhere safer than where they started. On the carved Egyptian wall scenes, the big official "We Survived" artwork, you don't just see warriors with shields, you also see carts loaded with possessions, with women and children moving along the column. That kind of baggage train looks less like a quick raid and more like relocation under pressure. Whatever else was going on, violence, pressure, conflict, this part of the movement has the shape of relocation, an entire life being packed up and pushed down the road. Even the sea part can mislead. In a Mediterranean stitched together by shipping lanes, boats are highways, not birth certificates. Arriving by water tells you the route was open, not that everyone shared one homeland. And there's another wrinkle that makes the label wobble. Some of these same named groups show up earlier in totally different roles: hired fighters, guards, auxiliaries. The invader of one decade can look an awful lot like the mercenary of the previous one. If that feels familiar, it's because modern headlines do it too. One label can flatten refugees, raiders, and regular migrants into the same faceless category. So, Sea Peoples works better as a storm label than a tribal name. Many groups, many motives, one collapsing world pushing people into motion. The Philistines belong inside that storm, but they aren't the storm itself. If this is the kind of story you like to sit with, the Ancient Secrets mug, Armchair Archaeology Edition, was built for it. Weighty, heat-holding, and made to feel like a small artifact that lives on the desk. It's linked in the pinned comment and description.
Walk into an excavation at a Philistine coastal city, and you'll see it before anyone explains it. The sherd trays start looking off for the neighborhood. Not off as in fake, off as in the shapes and paint feel like they belong at a different dinner table. In the layers right after the late Bronze Age world stumbles,
New pottery shows up with an Aegean accent. Wide bowls with flaring rims, pouring jugs with familiar proportions, painted bands and looping motifs that echo across the sea. It's like flipping through a family photo album and realizing that halfway through, everyone's clothes suddenly change. Same houses, new style. Pottery matters because it's not a luxury, it's infrastructure. Pots are kitchens, pantries, and party platters. They're what you cook in, store in, and serve guests with. 3 chances a day to repeat a habit until it feels normal. So when a community starts choosing new shapes in bulk, it isn't just decoration, it's routine. It's identity you can stack on a shelf. Of course, objects travel. Traders carry goods, locals imitate whatever looks impressive. A single foreign-looking cup doesn't prove anything except somebody had money or connections. But on these sites, the change isn't one odd import tucked into a corner. It's a wave of new forms appearing together right at the moment the old international system is cracking. And here's the detail that shifts the whole story. Some of these Aegean-looking pots aren't made from imported clay at all. They're made from local Canaanite earth. The material is native, the blueprint isn't. Someone knew the shapes well enough to reproduce them from scratch, like carrying a recipe across the sea and cooking it with whatever ingredients you find on this shore. Those painted sherds don't solve the mystery, they point to it. Once the tableware changes this fast, you have to ask, what else arrived with it?
Ashkelon doesn't look like the kind of place that should keep secrets. It sits on the coast, open to the sea breeze, built for traffic, ships, traders, strangers coming and going. And for a long time, that's exactly how the Philistines felt in the archaeological record. We could walk their streets, catalog their pottery, map their buildings, but the people themselves stayed frustratingly out of reach. Because cities are loud. Cemeteries are personal. A settlement can tell you what a community made and bought. A burial ground can tell you who was actually living there. Men and women, children and elders, locals and newcomers, the sick and the healthy. It's where you stop talking about a culture like it's a costume and start dealing with bodies that carry diets, diseases, and family ties. Ashkelon matters because it gives archaeologists that missing archive, not in the form of a dramatic treasure, but in the quiet layout of graves beyond the living space, the kind of place you only make if you expect your descendants to still be around to remember it. And once you have burials with reliable dates and clear context, what layer the grave cuts into, what pottery and buildings surround it, you can finally do something the older debates struggled with: separate style from people. That context is everything. A skeleton by itself can't announce Philistine. It has to be anchored to a specific moment and place. Early Iron Age levels in a Philistine city, alongside the material shifts we just talked about. Otherwise, you're just sampling someone from the past and hoping the story fits. This is where Ashkelon becomes a hinge in the whole narrative. Bones don't only preserve height and age, they can preserve chemical clues to diet and movement, and, when preservation allows, fragments of ancient DNA. The city gives us the stage, the cemetery gives us the cast, and once you can match the cast to the moment the props changed, you're finally in a position to ask the question that matters. Did the Aegean-looking world at the dinner table come with new people, or just new tastes? In a museum display, a Philistine sherd can look dramatic. In a genetics lab, the most dramatic thing is often a speck of dust that isn't supposed to be there. Ancient DNA work starts with restraint. Clean rooms, masks, gloves, bone sampled as carefully as if it were glass. Because you're not looking for a story, you're looking for a signal so faint it can be drowned out by one modern fingerprint. When it works, what you get isn't a label like Philistine stamped on a skeleton. You get a pattern of relatedness,
more like closer to this set of populations than that one, than a neat identity tag. It's a good reminder in the age of ancestry kits. DNA can tell you about movement and mixing, but it can't tell you what someone felt they were. Ashkelon is perfect for this kind of question because the city gives you a timeline. People buried before the cultural shift, people buried right as the new pottery and new habits appear, people buried later, after Philistine life is fully established. It's like lining up snapshots of the same street taken years apart and watching what changes and what doesn't. In those earliest Iron Age individuals, right at the moment the material culture takes its sharp turn, a genetic component shows up that wasn't appearing the same way in earlier Ashkelon remains. It points north and west across the sea, closest, statistically, to Southern Europe, Aegean-related ancestry. Not a clean "they were Greeks," not a single homeland, not a neat ethnic badge, just a trace of recent ancestors arriving from that direction and becoming part of the city's families. That's the part pottery can't do on its own. A bowl can be traded, a motif can be copied, an ancestor is harder to explain away. Then, almost as quickly as it appears, the signal starts to thin out in later generations from the same place. Not because anyone vanished, because people blended. Intermarriage, neighbors, kids growing up fluent in two sets of habits, maybe languages too. The coastline didn't just receive a new culture like a package, it absorbed newcomers the way a city absorbs everyone, one household at a time. At this point in the evidence, what convinces you more? A sudden arrival of outsiders or a local society reshaping itself under pressure? That genetic signal doesn't fade because the Philistines failed. It fades for the most ordinary reason imaginable. People met, paired off, had kids, and stopped being separable on paper. If you line the Ashkelon DNA results up across time, the pattern is almost cinematic. In the earliest Iron Age sample, the Aegean-related component is clear enough to tell you real newcomers are in the mix. A few generations later, that same component is much harder to pick out, diluted into the broader local gene pool. The coastline didn't become a walled-off colony, it became a neighborhood. And this is where genetics and archaeology finally start speaking the same language. Cultural identity doesn't dilute at the same speed as ancestry. Objects can outlast origin stories. A community can keep making certain bowls, cooking in certain pots, favoring certain foods, long after the first arrivals have married into local families, and their descendants are, biologically, mostly local in the broadest sense. That's the trap people fall into when they hear DNA results, the urge to treat genes as destiny. But identity is built on repetition, not percentages. It's the same misunderstanding people have today when a test result turns into a personality, like a pie chart that's supposed to explain your traditions. What do you serve at a feast? What do you bring to a neighbor's house? What do you teach your children is ours? Those answers can persist even as family trees weave together. So the real takeaway isn't Philistines were foreigners or Philistines weren't foreigners. It's that Philistine identity seems to form in the overlap. New people arriving during a collapse, quickly blending into the local population, while certain habits and styles remain distinct enough to be recognizable for centuries. Rapid genetic mixing with durable cultural markers is exactly what you'd expect from migrants settling down, rather than migrants passing through. In other words, the Philistines don't look like an island dropped onto Canaan. They look like a braid. Strands from different directions woven into one community, so tightly, so fast, that by the time later writers are cursing the Philistines, the people behind the name are already deeply entangled with the land they're accused of not belonging to.
If you want to see identity in the ancient world, don't start with speeches, start with dinner. Food is where boundaries get enforced quietly. You can share a marketplace and still not share a table. And in the southern Levant, that boundary sometimes leaves a very specific trail in the dirt: pig bones. At several early Philistine-associated sites, archaeologists find noticeably more pig remains than you'd expect if everyone in the region was following the same food rules. Not because every Philistine meal was pork, but because the pattern is steady. Pigs were being raised, butchered, and eaten in a way that stands out compared with nearby communities where pork is rare or avoided. What makes that detail bite is that pigs aren't the easiest animal to build a default diet around. They don't give you milk or wool. They compete with humans for food scraps and grain. They don't travel like herds of sheep and goats. So when pork shows up again and again in household waste, it isn't just someone grabbing whatever was available. It suggests a community comfortable keeping pigs close and using them regularly. That's a choice, and choices are where identity lives. In a mixed coastal city, locals and newcomers living side by side, food becomes an efficient way to say, "This is us," without ever saying it out loud. You can adopt local building techniques, trade with your neighbors, marry across families, and still keep a few habits that draw a line at the table. It's the same basic dynamic you see today with food rules and identity. Kosher, halal, vegetarian, fasting days, signals you can practice daily, in public, without a flag. Of course, it's not a cartoon. Not every Philistine ate the same way, and not every Israelite site looks identical. Diet shifts with ecology, class, and bad harvest years. But as a broad pattern, pork helps us glimpse the social architecture underneath the artifacts, how a population can blend genetically and still maintain distinct cultural signals in daily life. The Philistines weren't defined only by where their ancestors came from. They were also defined by what they kept choosing, meal after meal, while everyone was watching.
Stand in the story's famous valley for a second. Two armies facing off, heat shimmering, and one champion walking out like he owns the space between them. In the version most of us inherit, Goliath isn't just an opponent. He's a genre, the giant villain, the inhuman obstacle the hero must overcome so the world feels morally tidy. That framing starts to wobble once you put him back on the Philistine coastline. Philistine's strength wasn't born in a vacuum. It came from city life, ports, workshops, warehouses, and city-states that could cooperate or compete depending on the moment. These were communities plugged into Mediterranean currents, where styles, foods, and technologies didn't just arrive, they got repurposed into local normal. After the late Bronze Age collapse, that kind of connectivity is power. It can mean better access to metal, better gear, and the kind of elite warrior culture that produces champions designed to intimidate before a fight even begins. Something every age understands, from polished uniforms to military parades. Even the giant detail may have been stretched by the way enemy stories work. Some of the earliest textual traditions describe him as enormous without leaning so hard into the almost supernatural height people love to repeat. He's still frighteningly big, just not otherworldly. More exceptional human in heavy armor than walking mountain. And that matters, because an intimidating champion is exactly the sort of figure a militarized coastal society could field, and exactly the sort of figure an opponent's memory would later enlarge into symbol. That's what hostile traditions often do. They flatten the enemy's humanity and inflate their menace. The Philistines become a stereotype. Their champion becomes a caricature of foreign threat. It makes for a clean story, but a less true one. Archaeology and genetics don't erase the drama, they change the lighting. They remind us that the duel, however it happened, belonged to a real, blended world. One where Philistine identity wasn't a single invader essence, but a hybrid shoreline society built in the churn of collapse. In that world, Goliath steps out first as a man, before he becomes a legend. By the time you've seen the pottery shift, the DNA pulse, the fast mixing, and the food boundaries, the Philistines stop looking like a simple "came from X" label. They start looking like a process, something that happened to real people in real time. Because Philistine isn't just a question of origin, It's a question of formation. What do you call a community when newcomers arrive during a crisis, marry into local families, adopt local materials, and still keep certain habits distinct enough that neighbors notice? You get something that's neither a sealed-off colony nor a culture that disappears. You get a new identity that's negotiated, lived into existence until it feels obvious in hindsight. That's not ancient only either. It's how port cities and border regions still work when people arrive, settle, and blend, while outsiders argue over labels. That's why the rapid genetic dilution matters so much. It's a warning label against the way we misuse DNA. Genes can show movement, yes. They can show mixing, yes. But they don't tell you what people called themselves, who they married for love versus politics, or which traditions they decided were worth keeping. Cultural identity rides on repetition, the bowls you reach for, the foods you cook, the styles you prefer, the stories you tell about where you belong. And it's also why the Sea Peoples label is so slippery. It's not a single tribe sweeping in like a wave. It's a messy human storm. Groups on the move for different reasons, colliding with local communities that are also adapting under pressure. The Philistines are one outcome of that storm, a coastal society that absorbs newcomers quickly while producing a recognizable cultural signature that lasts. If you had a simplest takeaway, it's this. The Philistines don't teach us that the past was pure. They teach us that the past was normal. People migrate, they intermarry, they borrow, they argue about food, they keep some customs and drop others. And then, later, someone writes a story that turns those messy neighbors into a single convenient enemy. So when we say we're rewriting the Philistines, we're not swapping one stereotype for another. We're watching a name harden around a blended community and realizing how often history works exactly like that.
And now we can pay off that tiny artifact from Goliath's world, the one that doesn't prove the legend, but makes the cartoon version of it feel a lot less secure. At Philistine Gath, modern Tel Es-Safi, archaeologists found a small pottery sherd with an inscription scratched onto it, dated to the early Iron Age. It isn't a heroic monument. It isn't a victory stele. It's the kind of everyday, breakable object that ends up in the dirt because someone used it, dropped it, and moved on. And on it are names written in a local script, names that in sound and structure are strikingly close to the kind of name we associate with Goliath. Not "this belonged to the Goliath," not "we found the giant's cup," just a quiet, grounded reminder that names like that fit naturally in Philistine Gath at exactly the right time. That matters because it pulls the story out of monster myth space and back into human space. If the name type is normal in the city tradition places him in, then Goliath doesn't have to be a supernatural exception. He can be what our evidence has been pointing toward all along, a man from a coastal society built in the churn of collapse, Aegean echoes arriving, local life absorbing them fast, and a new identity forming in the overlap. So the Philistines aren't a single invading blob, and they aren't a cardboard enemy invented for a moral lesson. They're what history produces when worlds break. Migrants, locals, marriages, meals, arguments, borrowings, and a name that hardens into a label outsiders use. If you had to rewrite one thing after today, it's this. The most famous Philistine isn't interesting because he's a giant. He's interesting because he steps out of a real, blended world and only later gets turned into a symbol. If this reframed how you see the Philistines, tell me in the comments what hit you hardest. The DNA result, the Sea Peoples reality check, or the pork boundary? Like, share, and subscribe to Armchair Archaeology, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next dig.
Next stops on screen: why we can't find the world's first capital or the full Middle East playlist, both linked on screen. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, empires broke, families moved, names survived on broken clay, and the past is still shaping what we think we know today.